And so we're going to see that. So the other thing that we tend to associate with the book of Daniel are those prophecies at the end. And honestly, like for many, it's just confusing. Like, what is that? And there's these visions and this apocalyptic type stuff. And it becomes, for some people, the context for incredible debates, and they stake positions, and they lay out timelines and graphs, and here's what happens, and there's a strange amount of intensity and passion sometimes for people who are trying to sort that stuff out. And so you've got like this mix in Daniel of like these great Bible stories and this strange prophecy that we're trying to make sense of. And what I want us to see is there's more for us than just a couple of really good Bible stories and some prophecies that we're not sure what to do with. And so what we're going to do is explore some key themes through the events in the book of Daniel that are described, and we're going to overlay it on how we operate and how we're faithful to God today. And why I'm so excited is I think you're going to find like there's some crazy great application for us today in our modern society in the book of Daniel. So here's the big theme that I want to give you as we jump in, and it's sort of the unifying theme of Daniel. And that theme is this. And so this is going to show up in just about every place we go. So in spite of what it may look like, God is in control. That's like the key overarching theme. Whatever it looks like to you, whatever it feels like to you, God is in control. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you're doomed by the empire. But God is in control. Daniel in the lion's den, what a ridiculous setup, so unfair. It's okay. God is in control. The broccoli and water diet that should shed muscle, right? And move you toward anemia. But God is in control, so it works out. Or how about the unstoppable, arrogant kings who take prisoners and ruin nations? Don't worry about it. God's in control. The dreams and visions are all looking ahead like, hey, I know it doesn't look great, but here's some hints that the story's going to turn out all right. And you know why? God's in control. So it's like one of these big themes over the whole book of Daniel. In spite of what it looks like, in spite of what it feels like to you, God is in control. And so the book of Daniel then tells the story of just a handful of Israelites, just a few, who were taken captive when Babylon conquered Jerusalem. And so you got these four God-fearing men, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so here's one of the key questions that we get to wrestle with from the book of Daniel, one that's going to be really relevant for us. And here's the question: what does it look like to worship and follow God in Babylon? What does it look like to worship and follow God in Babylon in a culture that runs against the worship of God? So what's this going to look like now? Like, if you're going to be faithful to God in Babylon, then here's what you've got to understand. You are absolutely moving against culture. So if it's helpful, picture a flowing river, a moving current. So in our previous ministry in Washington, we every year had an outdoor baptismal service. And it took place in the cool flowing waters of the Skagit River up in the mountains. And I say cool flowing waters because the waters were fed by snow melt from the top. And so when I say cool, like for me and the pastors, when we did the baptism, like we would get in 2 minutes early so our legs could go numb. so that no, I'm not, I'm not kidding, like literally, so, okay, I'm numb, let's go. Like, it's kind of, because it was just so painful to get in there. But anyway, so we would do our baptismal services here. And so it was a little bit of pressure. Like, yes, we had a warm tank at the church, so if you want to be a sissy Christian, like, you can get baptized there. Like, that's an option. But if you really want to be a follower of Jesus, you can also do it in the Skagit River. It's up to you. No pressure. But here's the other thing about the Skagit River. So to look at it, it didn't look like it was moving swiftly. It's not like there was white water, not like you could see the ripples or the rapids. But the moment you stepped in, it was moving you. There was this steady moving current. And so even for me, when I would get in, like, you kind of step in, and if you wind up doing sideways steps because the water is moving you. And so you get in and you find your place and you kind of ground yourself like, okay. And if you don't, you're going to slowly start stepping with the movement of the water. So much so, again, not kidding, we would have a catcher a little bit down when we baptized kids. Thankfully, we never needed the catcher. But like, the movement was enough. They were like, let's just have somebody stationed down there just in case. and so here's what I want you to kind of catch. When you looked at it, you didn't necessarily notice a moving current. But when you stepped in, you realized it's a little stronger than what I thought it would be. And here's the other thing about the moving current. So it takes zero effort to go with it. None. Like, if you choose not to exert any effort, relax, go with the flow. But on the other side, it takes intentional effort to not go with it. You've got to find solid footing. You've got to find something that you can hang on to. You've got to find a way to intentionally hold your ground, because if you don't, you get moved with the current. So keep this image in mind as we look at the book of Daniel. Back to the question. So what does it look like to be a follower of God in Babylon? How do you hold your ground? How do you stay faithful to God when the current of the culture continually moves against that? Just like the river current, if you do nothing, you go with it. So back to the young men in Babylon. So here's what I want you to see. So when they were home in their land, they knew how to follow God. They knew where to go. You go to the temple. They knew when to go. They knew what to do. They knew what was required. They knew the special days and feasts, the celebration, the repentance. They knew all of that. They had rhythms for all of this. It was woven into their lives. It was woven into the culture. But now they're foreigners in Babylon. They're strangers in a strange land. They're outsiders. That's what we're calling the series, Outsiders. So here's the thing. God's still God. And they still want to be faithful to him. But they have to figure out, so what does that look like in Babylon? And here's what we know for sure, that their worship could not look the same as it did back home. Because see, the way it used to be, their worship went with the current. And now it doesn't. So now how do we do this? And that's what they had to figure out. How do we follow God in this massive shift that has just taken place in our lives? So let's step into modern day here. from a sociological, theological perspective, we are currently living in what is now referred to as a post-Christian culture. And you're like, yep, that's true. And I'm sure you're aware of it. I'm sure you feel that. But let's talk quickly about what that means to be in a post-Christian culture. So it means that previously, Christian values and practices played an important and prominent role in society and culture. So it was normal. It went with the current, right? And so Christians were respected and influential. Generally, church attendance, following Jesus, Christian values were accepted, appreciated. It was understood that they brought value to the culture. And that's not where we're living today. And the reaction of many Christians in the post-Christian world is to kick and rail and say, how do we get back to what it used to be? It was so much better before. And we wonder how we get back to that. We got to change the culture back. We got to get the current going the other way again. And here's what I want us to see in the book of Daniel. From that perspective, when that's how we look at everything, we're kind of saying this: God used to be in control, but now he's not. We got to get back to when he used to be in control. God used to have influence in the culture, but now he doesn't. We got to get back to when he has influence, which is, I'm sure, how Daniel and his friends felt, right? Like, we've gone from God has influence to God doesn't have influence, to God's in control to God is definitely not in control now. This is how it looks and how it feels. So they've lived in this culture previously where the worship of God was influential and central, and now they're living in Babylon and they're cultural outsiders. We can relate to this. So in some similar ways, we have to figure out, what does it look like to follow Jesus in the post-Christian era? You may think it was better before, but that's not where we're living currently. So what we have to figure out is, so how are we to be faithful followers of Jesus in a whole different flow of culture? I mean, I don't think I'm going to shock anybody to say you might feel like an outsider, right? I mean, things have shifted, and you may feel like your core beliefs and values are not appreciated or respected, maybe even mocked and opposed sometimes. So there may be something for us in the book of Daniel, huh? Maybe. So this is one of the big themes that we're going to find in the book of Daniel. How do you follow God when the current pushes against that? That's what they had to figure out. But again, put the big theme, overlay it, because this one is under it, following God when the current goes against it. Because the big theme is still this: no matter what it looks like, no matter what it feels like, no matter how you think the current is going, God is still in control. So you may not be in the position of influence or power, but that doesn't mean God's not in control. And you're going to get to watch this in dramatic ways in the book of Daniel. That no matter what it looks like, he is very much in control. So here's what I want to do, just kind of as the setting for what we're going to do over the next several weeks. I want to go to the first two verses, and I want to read them to you again. And it's probably not going to look like much to you at first, but we're going to explore what's happening here. So here's what we read in the first two verses. During the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylon and placed them in the treasure house of his God. So here's what I want you to see in these verses, that these first 2 verses of Daniel provide 2 different lenses to view history. So the first one, in verse 1, is what we might call the secular view of history, and it's a point from purely human observation. So it gives us the facts. This is what happened, here's when it happened, here's who did it, here's who it happened to. These are the facts. But verse 2 offers a different perspective, sort of a peek behind the scenes for what might be called a sacred view. And so you pull the curtain back and you get to see something beyond the facts. You get to see what's happening behind the scenes. And so we read this, that the Lord gave Nebuchadnezzar the victory. So from the secular view, you're like, oh man, Nebuchadnezzar won. From the sacred view, you read, only because the Lord allowed that. The Lord permitted him to take the sacred objects from the temple. So again, from the secular view, you're like, oh man, he just looted the temple. But verse 2 tells us, it's okay. God allowed that. So here's what we need to see in the big picture, that Nebuchadnezzar was probably the most powerful person in the world at that time. He was an unstoppable force, but that is not the reason he conquered Jerusalem and looted the temple. The reason he did that is because God allowed it. So you've got the facts, here's what happened, and then you've got the peek behind the curtain, the sacred view that says, big theme, yeah, God's still in control. In spite of what it looks like, in spite of what it feels like, God is in control. So it may not look like that from where you stand. May not look like that from what you can see. If you're just looking at facts, if you're just looking at the events and saying this, and this happened, and you're not getting the peek behind the curtain, then it may not look like God is in control. But here's what Daniel is reminding us. God is always in control. And Babylon wouldn't and couldn't conquer Jerusalem unless God allowed that. And King Nebuchadnezzar, for all of his power, wouldn't and couldn't loot that temple unless God allowed it. So here's what we get to see then. These powerful people, right, like Nebuchadnezzar, who wield tremendous influence and control over people's lives, including Daniel, right? And so on the level of human observation, we're looking at it and saying the guy is unstoppable. Nobody can do anything about this. But we're invited to see behind the scene. And we learn, nope, God's got this. So there's some peace, some reassurance that comes from that, right? And if we're going to be honest, there are also a couple questions that come from that. But we're reminded from the outset in the book of Daniel that, hey, there are things that you can see, and there may be some things you don't see, but are the things that are actually moving everything you see. And we're going to get multiple glimpses of the power and sovereignty of God. And it's going to hopefully bring us back to that place of, okay, even if I can't see behind the scenes, I believe that God is up to something. That's the whole point. and all the prophecies at the end of the book that are confusing. It's like, here's the message. God is in control. So let's come back again to our modern day as we finish up here. Because there might be something here for us, right? So from the perspective of secular history, the secular point of view, like in the culture we live in, we see moral and political ideologies, right? We see battles between opposing views in our country and other countries, actually. The opposing views of conservatives and progressives, these culture wars and these competing philosophies. And so if you look through the lens of politics or economics or sociology or philosophy, if you look through any of those lenses, you're going to be like, oh man, this is a mess. Let me say this from the outset. There is nothing we're going to do here that is related to politics at all. Because here's the reality, and we would be so good to be reminded of this. Politics never was going to save us, ever. And so you go back to the New Testament. Remember when Jesus came as the Messiah, and they're like, yes, he's going to conquer Jerusalem. And then Rome kills him. That was not what we expected. Jesus came and people had an idea of like, oh, so here's what he's going to do. He's going to overthrow and he's going to clear the deck. And oh, wait, he died. He gave his life. That's not how we thought that was going to go. And when he was resurrected, that changed everything. But guess what? Rome was still Rome. Rome was still in power. Rome was brutal and vicious to followers of Jesus. The hope never is or was in politics. So what I want to do is give us an invitation to maybe view the madness differently. To listen to the rhetoric with different ears. And to see with a different lens, the sacred lens from verse 2. Knowing that no matter what it looks like and no matter what it feels like, God is in control. Believing that if we could pull back the curtain, that we would see nothing has happened that caught God off guard. There is nothing that has happened that God is like, oh my goodness, what just happened there? Now what am I going to do? Nothing. And so we come back to the question of, so what does it look like to trust God, to follow God, to be faithful to Him when it looks like, at least from the outside, that this is not how things should be going? But again, for Daniel and his friends, even while they're in Babylon, God's still God. Nothing shifted there, not even a smidgen. And so here's what I want to give you from the outset of this series, but also as we head into election chaos, right? Because what you're going to hear over the upcoming months, the next 2 months, what you're going to hear is we have a 50-50 shot of making it. And by the way, both sides is claiming, go with us, you'll make it. If you don't, well, you got what you voted for, right? And so both parties, both candidates are going to say, hey, if you elect us, we can save the country. And the other party is going to say, I mean, if you elect us, we can save the country. And both of them are going to say, if you elect the other, we're doomed. But make your choice. But here's the bottom line from that perspective, just that secular perspective. Here's the bottom line. You better get this right or we are all doomed. Right? Like that's the message. And so when we hear this message, how much peace do you feel? Like it feels like so much is on the line. And I'm thankful we have a vote, but guess what? You just have one. And so here's what I want to invite us to, is a different perspective. And here's the bottom line, right? Whatever happens, God is in control. And I know, like, some of us, our instincts say, God would never allow this. And then you go to the book of Daniel, he literally allowed King Nebuchadnezzar to have the power to do what he did. He gave it to him. So here's the big picture for the start of the series, but also for the start of the chaos. Do not lose sight of the fact that God is in control. And that's the point from the first two verses. And what you're going to see as then we go through is, listen, God raises up kings and he brings them down. He gives authority, but he also takes it away. What you're going to see in the book of Daniel is that the kings are surprisingly small in God's sovereignty. And the power they have that seems so unstoppable is gone like that if God says the word. That they will rise to power and fall from power when God says so. And you're going to see it in dramatic ways. Here's what's interesting in the book of Daniel. Multiple kings come and go in Daniel's life. So he serves in the administration of 3 different kings. That's its own miracle right there. Like, can you imagine anybody who serves in different political administrations consecutively as a voice of influence? That's strange. But here's the perspective I want you to see. So here's Daniel. He's the captive, held against his will, forced to serve in a foreign kingdom. You don't have a choice. But now watch what happens. 70 years later, 2 kings are gone, another king's in power, and guess who's been there the whole time? Daniel. Which is interesting because, as near as we can tell from the outside, he had 0 power and they had all the power. He was taken as a captive and they're the captors. And yet what you get to see in the book is that God raises up kings and he brings them down. Or we could say it for our time, he raises up presidents and he brings them down. See how there might be something relevant here for us? What if we could learn to see through the sacred verse, that sacred lens of verse 2? Because here's what that would mean. If the candidate you didn't vote for winds up in office, well, guess what? The person's not actually in charge. They're only there because God allowed it. But it's also true the other way. If the candidate you voted for winds up in office, guess what? They're actually not in control. God's in control, and they're only there because he allowed it. And so as we enter into the season, as we enter into the book of Daniel, as you listen to all kinds of extreme rhetoric, and as you feel the anxiety and the angst, I think there's something for us. That no matter what happens, there's something going on behind the scenes that we may not get full view of yet, but God is not going to be outvoted. God is not going to be outmaneuvered. He is not going to be outdone. He's not going to be surprised. He's not going to be caught off guard. We might be, but he will never be. And so over the upcoming weeks, we're going to lean into this in the book of Daniel. We're going to be reminded that no matter what it looks like, You're going to get tired of hearing it, but I bet you're going to remember it. That no matter what it looks like, God is in control. We're going to be reminded that God raises up kings and presidents and nations and he brings them down. And we're going to wrestle with. So what does it look like for us to live as faithful followers of Jesus when we feel like outsiders? How do you be faithful in Babylon? When the current feels like it's just rushing against us, how do we hold our ground? That's the stuff we're going to get to explore in the book of Daniel. Maybe you're weirdly excited with me. And if not, I'll just be the only weirdly excited one as we do this, and I'll try to give it to you somehow. But I just think this is a timely, relevant message for us to hear and to listen in the middle of what feels like chaos, in the middle of fear and angst and a lack of peace, like to step back and say, it's okay. Like, I don't know how everything plays out, and I don't know when, but here's what I do know, that there's nothing that's going to catch God off guard. Nothing that's going to force him to regroup. Nothing that's going to happen that hasn't been allowed by God. So what does it look like, wherever we find ourselves, to be faithful to who God is, to worship him and to follow him, no matter what unfolds? We're going to sing a hymn together. Speak, O Lord.